The SEALs were clustered around the fire pit. Music was blaring, some hard rock song, and most of the operators were adjusting their kit one final time. There was an air of tension, but that was not uncommon before any tough mission. I sensed no fear, just anticipation and a desire to get the operation underway. "Kill the music," one SEAL yelled as I approached. They closed in around me, and I turned to Ferris so he could say a few words. Even though he was an Army NCO, he had the respect of everyone in the SEAL community. Ferris reminded them of the British SAS motto, "Who dares wins." Tonight, we were daring greatly, and he told them he was confident they would come home victorious. Ferris turned to me. I hadn't put a lot of thought into what I might say, but it occurred to me just moments before, as I was walking from the jock, that everyone gathered around the fire pit was thinking the same thing. "Gentlemen, first, let me say that I talked to the president yesterday evening, and he told me to pass on his thanks and appreciation for what you are about to do." Most of the men were in deep thought, their heads cast downward, but I could tell that they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. I moved a little closer to the fire and scanned the group of men standing before me. They were rough-looking, serious, professional, focused. They had their game face on, but I knew that beneath the body armor, they were like any other men. They had families, wives and kids, friends back in Virginia Beach. They were good men, men you would want as your friends, your neighbors, men you could count on when things got bad, men who loved each other as only those who have experienced combat together can. They didn't know what the night would bring, but they knew they were lucky to be chosen for this mission, and that was my message. It was simple. "Gentlemen, since 9/11, each one of you has dreamed of being the man going on the mission to get bin Laden. Well, this is the mission, and you are the men. Let's go get bin Laden." There were no smiles, no cheering, and no contrived jubilation. It was time to get to work. So that's an excerpt from the book Sea Stories by Admiral William McRaven, and that's who we're going to be diving into tonight, trying to study, or today, just study some of the lessons from McRaven and his life and the leadership lessons that he's trying to pass on. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Admiral McRaven, he spent 37 years in the SEAL teams, and he retired as a 4-star admiral and the commander of the United States Special Operations Command. He retired in 2014. He worked under both President Bush and Obama. He mentioned on one of the Jocko podcasts that he was on that he thinks he touched over 10,000 operations during his career. So that excerpt that I just read was from Operation Neptune Spear, which is obviously a very well known. He was responsible for Saddam Hussein after he was captured. And if you read his books, there's just story after story after story of operations that he was involved in throughout his career. He had a really famous, I guess you could call it, viral commencement speech that he did at UT titled "Make Your Bed." If you haven't heard it, you should definitely check that out. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to be diving into tonight, some of his leadership lessons. He's had a lot of influence on me since I've been reading his books and listening to him on the Jocko podcast over the last several years. And the primary book I want to dive in tonight is one called The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, which is what he kind of calls his leadership book. So a lot of his books are stories, but Wisdom of the Bullfrog is him trying to condense all his leadership lessons down into a single book. But before we dive into that book, I want to give a little bit more context about McRaven and dive into a story from early in his career. So this story, it comes from the book Make Your Bed, and it's talking about early in his career when he was about 4 or 5 years in to the SEAL team. So here we go. He says, "July 1983 was one of those tough moments. As I stood there before the commanding officer, I thought my career as a Navy SEAL was over. I had just been relieved of my SEAL squadron, fired for trying to change the way my squadron was organized, trained, and conducted missions. There were some magnificent officers and enlisted men in the organization, some of the most professional warriors I'd ever been around. However, much of the culture was still rooted in the Vietnam era, and I thought it was time for a change. As I was to find out, change is never easy, particularly for the person in charge. Fortunately, even though I was fired, my commanding officer allowed me to transfer to another SEAL team, but my reputation as a SEAL officer was severely damaged. Everywhere I went, other officers and enlisted men knew I had failed, and every day there were whispers and subtle reminders that maybe I wasn't up for the task of being a SEAL. At that point in my career, I had two options: quit and move on to civilian life, which seemed like the logical choice in light of my recent officer fitness report, or weather the storm and prove to others and myself that I was a good SEAL officer. I chose the latter. And the reason I wanted to highlight this story is just because, at least for me, as I listen to these guys on podcasts, especially folks that are successful in whatever their domain is. Obviously, McRaven's in the military. You can extend this over to people in business and sports, whatever the domain it is. It's very easy to listen to them at the end of their journey, at the end of the career, and think that they were always destined to get to that point. At least I think that way. When I listen to McRaven, it's easy for me to think like, okay, yeah, he was 25 at this point, but obviously he was a stud and on his way there. And when you read stories like this, it gives you that context of getting back into the seat and say, hey, he was 28 years old this time. All he's ever wanted to be is a SEAL. He finally got there, and here he is 5 years in. This, I'm sure being a SEAL is his entire world at this point, and here he is getting fired. And just, I try to think about myself being in that situation. If I'd been at an organization for 5 years, it was the organization that I just came out of college and started working in, and had been busting my butt for 5 years, and I get fired. And what does that situation feel like? And then obviously he makes the decision to stay in the SEAL teams, and now he's got to go back in front of other officers and enlisted men in his community and try to gain his reputation back. And like I said, I love this story. I think it reflects a lot of his career, which is failing, getting back up, making the next tough decision, and moving on. And I wanted to take a little clip from Jocko Podcast 290. I think one of the questions that we like asking people with more experience is, hey, what advice would you give your younger self? And I love this part of the podcast because he actually talks about the advice that he gives young leaders in using the context of this story of him getting fired. So here we go. This is from McRaven and Jocko Podcast 290. This is his advice to young folks who are trying to become leaders. You're going to make mistakes. And the one thing I tell folks that are learning to be leaders, particularly in combat, is you're going to make mistakes. But you've got to be ready to make the next tough decision. Because if you're afraid to make the next tough decision when the last mission went bad, then you are not the leader we need you to be. Particularly in combat. Again, every once in a while, I would have a mission that would go south. And I knew we could have done things better. And I realized now the next mission comes along and you say, I don't know, should I do this? Should I not do this? And if you start to doubt yourself, if you start to question too much, if you're afraid to make the tough decisions, then you're putting the guys' lives at greater risk. So again, you've got to learn from those mistakes. You've got to do the best you can. But as a leader, you've got to be prepared to make the next tough decision. And if you're not, for fear of failing again, it's time to move on. And I always found that when things went south, invariably another opportunity would, particularly in combat, another opportunity is not far around the corner. Okay, so let's put our A game on. And when I got fired, it was the same thing. When a mission goes south and now you have another opportunity, you double down on everything. You want to make sure you are doing everything you can to be successful and get beyond that bad mission. That's how people progress. And like I said, I think that just speaks directly to that story. How do you handle these mistakes, these falls, these failures that you're going to have in your career? Like we talked about him getting fired, and read his book, Sea Stories, read the books he writes, and listen to the podcast, and you will hear time after time again that he makes decisions that go the wrong way. And how do you come back from those tough decisions? That's what he says here. You're going to make mistakes, but you have to be ready to make the next tough decision. Because if you're not ready to make the next tough decision for fear of failing again, it's time to move on, right? And so just figuring out that balance of, hey, how long do I dwell on this to make sure that I learn the lesson? And then how do I move on? Finding that balance, much easier said than done. And that's one of the things that McRaven talks about a lot, especially in his book, Wisdom of the Bullfrog, is these concepts are simple, but they're not easy, right? And I think this is one of them. And so that kind of leads us into his book, Wisdom of the Bullfrog. Like I said, this is his leadership book where he's trying to condense some of the leadership lessons he's learned in his career and pass those on down. So I'm going to take or read a little bit from the intro of the book. He says, as difficult as leadership is, it's not complicated. In its simplest form, leadership is accomplishing a task with the people and resources you have while maintaining the integrity of your institution. I'm going to pause right there and read that back. This is his definition of leadership. Leadership is accomplishing a task with the people and resources you have while maintaining the integrity of your institution. A good leader knows both how to inspire the men and women that work for them and how to manage the people and resources necessary to complete the task. But leadership is not just about getting the job done. It's also about maintaining or advancing the reputation of your institution. And I wanted to pause right there and just highlight, I've listened to Jocko a lot, I've listened to McRaven a lot, and a lot of other folks from the SEAL community. I'm not going to claim to be close to it personally at all, but one of the things I hear them say over and over and over again is the fact that your reputation is everything. And here we can see McRaven talking about reputation in his definition of leadership. Leadership is not just about getting the job done. It's about maintaining or advancing the reputation of your institution. When I read that, I was reminded of several Warren Buffett quotes. One of them is, we can afford to lose money, even a lot of money, but we cannot afford to lose reputation, even a shred of it, right? So reputation is everything to these guys in life. McRaven continues, how many times have we read about a university athletic program that was excelling in athletics but was caught in a cheating scandal along the way? Or a financial institution that made its stockholders a lot of money but eventually collapsed because they violated the law. As a leader, you fail the institution, you fail the institution you're leading, then you have failed, period. All right, so love that introduction to the book and kind of how he defines leadership. He also, even the first chapter of this book is actually Death Before Dishonor, which just hammers in more the importance of your reputation and maintaining your reputation throughout your career. And so continuing on in the introduction, this is going to give us a little bit of a context for how McRaven lays out this book, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog. And actually, circling back, I don't think I mentioned, it's called Wisdom of the Bullfrog because the Navy SEALs, they call themselves frogmen, and the bullfrog is, if I remember correctly, it is the current longest active duty SEAL. So McRaven was the bullfrog for, I believe it was 3 years. I want to say it was 2011 to 2014. For the first 2 years, he shared it. He was the co-bullfrog with somebody else. And then his last year, he was the sole bullfrog. So the bullfrog is the most senior the longest active SEAL in the teams at the moment. So that's why it's called Wisdom of the Bullfrog. Back into kind of how he structured the book the way he did. He says, so how do we make the difficult nature of leadership simple? Well, for thousands of years, military has provided mottos, creeds, parables, and stories to inspire, to motivate, and to guide leaders and followers alike. These sayings serve to reinforce certain behaviors. They also provide a memory prompt, a Pavlovian response, and an inspirational surge that helps direct individual actions in the midst of uncertainty. And I wanted to dive in tonight on one of these ideas that has stuck with me. He mentions here they are made to have a Pavlovian response, and one of his chapters in particular, titled When in Command, Command, has been one of those mantras that, for whatever reason, At the time I was introduced to the idea by McRaven. It's just stuck with me personally, and it's one that just often comes to mind as I'm making decisions, whether it's in life, whether it's in career stuff. I find myself thinking back to this lesson and this specific story that McRaven tells in the book, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog. So it's going to be one that I want to dive into. So I believe I want to say it's chapter 6 in the book. Sorry, chapter 3. Like I said, it's titled When in Command. Here we go. Let's dive in on some of these leadership lessons that McRaven is trying to pass on. So from the book, it says, in the spring of 1942, the intelligence on the Japanese intentions at Midway was anything but solid. Many in the Admiral's own ranks questioned the strategic benefit of trying to save Midway, and even more officers feared that an American defeat at Midway would mean a quick Japanese victory in the Pacific. The ramifications of a bad decision were calamitous, but the ramification of no decision might be an existential disaster. Nimitz reviewed the intelligence, consulted with his staff, and talked with his commanders, but the ultimate decision was his. He anguished over the decision for days. What would happen if he were wrong? Thousands of sailors might die. Thousands more would perish in the fighting on Midway and the island chains leading to Japan. The fate of the entire Navy and perhaps our nation rested on this decision. Legend has it that during a conversation with Admiral Bull Halsey, Nimitz confessed his apprehension. The weight of this decision about Midway was overwhelming him. Halsey, blunt as ever, reminded the Admiral of Nimitz's own personal conviction. You once told me, Halsey began, that when in command, command. It was the clarion call that Nimitz needed. He understood that commanders are expected to make the tough decision, to act with purpose, to be confident and lead from the front, to accept the challenge and steel yourself from the rough waters ahead. A commander must command. Command the situation, command the troops, command your fears, take command. All right, so I love that story, and I want to hit on a few ideas and things that this story makes me think of as I read through it. So the first thing is just putting it into perspective, the weight of the decisions that have been made by many people who are in the past. Obviously, I know for me, I go through my day-to-day and think that I have big decisions to make, and I feel the weight of these decisions, and sometimes it feels like it's too much. And then you read a story like this with Nimitz having to make the decision on whether or not to sail the fleet to Midway, and all of the things that whose fate is determined by the decision he makes here, right? I can't imagine just like I said, the weight of those decisions, and it just puts into perspective what we're doing on a daily basis. And at least for me, that helps lighten the load for me a little bit as I read stories like that and understand that perspective. Number 2 is dealing with the unknown. Obviously, a lot of times we hear, do the right thing is kind of a common phrase, but the reality is in a lot of leadership positions, the right answer isn't always obvious. And you're going to have to make decisions when you don't know what the outcome is going to be. You're going to be in positions where you wish you had more data. You wish you had more clarity on what the outcomes were going to be based on the decisions you make. But unfortunately, that's just not the reality. And you're going to be put in situations where you have to make decisions about the unknown, and you have to be able to navigate that. And I think that's really, as I read a lot of McRaven's books and I listen to him and I study him, that's one of the things that I read over and over again is just figuring out how do you make tough decisions. Whenever you're faced with these tough decisions, and McRaven had a bunch of them, how do you go about making the decisions? And that's really, I think, what we're kind of studying here today is how do we go about thinking about and making tough decisions when it's on our plate. And we're going to dive a little bit more into that here in a bit. Another idea from this story is we need to be reminded more than we need to be taught. So obviously in this story, Bull Halsey is helping Admiral Nimitz kind of navigate this situation. Admiral Nimitz obviously is the senior in this position, but he's struggling. He's facing incredibly hard decisions, and he is still learning. And in that moment, when he has to make that decision, he doesn't need to be taught a new lesson. He just needs to be reminded of one of his own mantras, right? He needs to be reminded to, when in command. And that circles back to just the intro that McRaven had in the book, right? Why is he writing this book? To provide the mottos, creeds, parables, and stories that provide a memory prompt, a Pavlovian response, and an inspirational surge that helps direct individual actions in the midst of uncertainty. So even Admiral Nimitz, he'd made thousands of difficult decisions in his career. He found himself in a spot where what he needed was to be reminded of one of his own mantras, and that's what helped him kind of get through that situation. So that was another idea that I had reading this story. We need to be reminded more than we need to be taught. And another one that I love from this story is a phrase called leading up the chain of command. That's the term Jocko uses. Some people call it managing up. But I think it's really important to point out Bull Halsey here. He is leading up the chain of command, right? So he's the subordinate, and he's the one who's taking it on himself to help his boss make this tough decision, to give him the feedback he needs, give him the support that he needs to continue on and make that decision. I think that's just important for us to remember as subordinates, and we have bosses, and just remembering our bosses are going to have times where they're going to struggle, and it's our job to support them and do everything that we can to help them succeed. And I really think it's a cool part of the story is Bull Halsey stepping up and helping Nimitz get back on track as he sits under the weight of that decision. So that was just a cool part of the story. And talking about kind of number twos in command, it reminded me of another story from McRaven. And this one's actually from podcast 383. And McRaven's talking about one of his number two in command. His name is Command Sergeant Major Chris Ferris. And here we go, diving in on what McRaven said on Jocko Podcast 383. He says, Ferris never hesitated to come into my office, close the door, and say, hey, sir, this is a bad idea. Or have you thought about it this way? And you need somebody like that, someone who's going to tell the truth to power. Certainly, as a leader, I've always expected and I encouraged the officers who worked for me, the senior enlisted who worked for me to say, hey, look, boss, I need to tell you something. Good. Tell me. I wouldn't wire brush you for it. I need to know what your concerns are, or I'm going to make a bad decision. And Ferris would always come in and we'd have the conversation, but once I made the decision, and this is an important part of leadership, the followership part of it. Once I made the decision, even if Ferris disagreed with it, or even if the master chiefs who worked for me disagreed with it, they would say, okay, sir, I got it. They'd kind of salute smartly and move out, and they owned that decision. Right, so this is, like I said, this is talking about, at least for me, what I'm taking away from this is, as a subordinate, how do you do a good job leading up the chain of command? One thing McRaven talks about here that Ferris does extremely well is passing the truth back up the chain of command, helping him understand the reality of what's going on the front lines. And the second part of that, what McRaven says, once I've made the decision, and this is an important part, even if Ferris disagreed with it, he would own it. And this part reminded me of something that's actually from Jeff Bezos's letters to shareholders. And quick pause for a second. If you haven't read Jeff Bezos's letter to shareholders, there's a fantastic book called Invent and Wonder, and it has all of the letters to shareholders that he wrote, and then also some context from speeches that he's given, and it has a bunch of fantastic stories. But in the 2016 letter to shareholders, he's talking about how to make decisions effectively as an organization. And one of the things or one of the mantras they have within Amazon is disagree and commit. And that's exactly what McRaven is talking about here with Ferris, is getting to a point where, hey, even if you have a disagreement on something, a decision needs to get made. And once that decision is made, you are committed to executing that decision and making the best version of that decision come to fruition, right? And so I think a lot of times we think of when we read leadership books, we think about being the leader at the top of the chain of command and how do we lead down. But I think a lot of these stories shed a lot of great light into, hey, how do you be an effective subordinate and support the leadership that is above you? And I think these are some great examples of, hey, how do you support that leadership above you? Number one, tell it to them how it is, help them understand the truth of the situation on the ground. And then also, even if you disagree with the decision that's made, you own that decision and make it happen. I know this is something that I've failed to do many times throughout my career. And it's a mistake that I made over and over and over again. If there was a decision that was made that I didn't think was the best decision, there was times where I did not completely bust my ass to make that solution that wasn't my solution come out to be the best in the end. And not in any major way, but there's little ways too. And I think it's easy to fall into that trap of disagreeing and then not committing to making that solution work out. So just something to note. So I think a lot of this kind of early on, especially the win in command, it talks about, we've talked about this a little bit, you're facing uncertainty. How do you go about making the decision? And the reality is, hey, at some point you just have to make a call. You're not going to get all of the answers that you need, but you need to make a call. And so next, I want to dive in a little bit on kind of building up to, hey, how do you start gathering information so that you can make a decision? What's the appropriate balance between gathering information and taking the time to prepare for the decision? And then when do you know that it's time to just make the decision, even though there's still maybe more information that you can gather or there's still uncertainty? How do we find that balance? And so with that, I want to actually dive in a little bit on the story of Operation Neptune Spear. Like I mentioned earlier, this is the excerpt that I read at the very beginning was from Operation Neptune Spear. So this is the mission to go and get bin Laden, and it's from Sea Stories. Get the book. He has a fantastic account, and he just goes into great details about how they approached the mission, how they were working with the CIA and the White House to figure out what they're going to do. And initially, they've got about 4 options for the mission. So at the time, a little bit of context, Osama bin Laden, they think he is in Pakistan. So they found a compound, and there's a man called the Pacer there, and they believe that the Pacer potentially is Osama bin Laden. One of the options is to work with the Pakistanis to go into the compound and get them. Another option is to bomb the compound. And reading the story, it would have taken I want to say it was a lot of big bombs that it would take to knock the compound down. I was surprised by how much explosives they would have had to drop on that thing to level it. But in the compound, they also thought there was about a dozen kids and about 5 women. So they wanted to make sure they minimized the collateral damage as much as they could, especially since they weren't sure if it was Osama bin Laden. Another option was a snatch and grab performed by the CIA Special Activities Division. And then the last option was the Special Operations Command. And so reading the book, they spend weeks and weeks evaluating what the best option is. And then McRaven is responsible for kind of evaluating the special operations rate. So that option number 4 is what McRaven is evaluating. So they're evaluating, hey, should we use helos to go in? Should we drive up to it? And there's a bunch of questions. They end up really focusing on the helos. Can the helicopters get there and back on the fuel? How risky is it refueling in Pakistan if they have to do that? What happens if a helo crashes? Will the Pakistanis be able to detect the helos? If so, how quickly can they react? One of the things that's going on is there is a police station 1 mile away from the compound. And then I think it's like 3 or 4 miles away is Pakistan's version of West Point. That's 3 or 4 miles away. It's got a whole infantry battalion there. And so then there's questions. He says they thought it would be 30 minutes before an element of the Pakistani battalion could arrive. There were more questions. Is the compound rigged with explosives? What do we do with the women and children? In the book, one of the questions that comes up, if they have a suicide vest or are armed and threaten the assault force, they will be killed. Oh, sorry. So the president, and this is Obama at the time, essentially asked, or I think it's the president, it may have been Secretary Clinton that asked the question, but he essentially asked, hey, what's going to happen if one of the kids or women or children pose a threat. And McRaven says, if they have a suicide vest or are armed and threaten the assault force, they will be killed. Sir, if there are people in the compound who pose a threat to the operators, they will be killed. It will be dark. It will be confusing. If it turns out that bin Laden is not in the compound, there are still likely to be dead Pakistanis as a result of the raid. All right. And so just walking into it, they've got a ton of questions, a bunch of information. Some of the information they can get, right, like the helo calculations. Hey, do we have enough fuel? Are we going to need to refuel? There's a million questions like that they can work their way through. And actually diving into the book on page 299, McRaven kind of talks about how he goes about laying out this decision and the decisions that he may have to make during the mission. So here we go, diving in on the book. He says, I directed the staff to build a decision matrix so that in the heat of the moment, if something went wrong on the mission, I didn't have to think through all the alternatives. We would work through all the possible problems ahead of time and be prepared with options. Most of the decisions were binary. If we were detected crossing the border, would we continue? Yes or no. If we were detected 100 miles out? Yes or no. 50 miles out? Yes or no? What if we had mechanical problems with the helicopter 100 miles out? What about 50 miles out? Once on target, what if bin Laden was not found within 15 minutes? Within 30 minutes? What if the Pakistanis converged on the target within 15 minutes or within 30 minutes? The list of possible problems was extensive, but the decisions were easy. Hard to make, but easy to discern. This is what McRaven always says, simple but not easy. If we were compromised crossing the border, we would turn around and try for another day. If we had a helo set down for mechanical problems at 100 miles out from the target, but the helo was not detected, we would continue on with the force we had. If the helo crashed, but we still had sufficient force to move to the target, we would continue the mission, but alert the quick reaction force and medevac. Everything was binary. On missions like these, you don't want emotions to drive your decisions. If we were compromised crossing the border and the Pakistanis threatened to shoot down our helos, you could easily convince yourself that the mission was so important that you must press forward. Decisions like this rarely ended well. And so, like I said, this kind of story for me, it's a study in how to make decisions and how to kind of gather some of the information for those decisions. So obviously here he says, hey, I made a decision matrix. Before we went into the mission, I laid out all the contingencies that I could think of, and I started writing out, hey, this is what we are going to do in each one of these cases, right? So how do we handle uncertainty? We plan as much as we can. We plan for those contingencies. And this is, like I said earlier, this is the question that keeps coming to my mind as I read these stories and as I think about these things, is how do we find the balance between spending the time to get the data and information you need and then making the call? And so actually diving back in on Jeff Bezos' shareholder letter, and I'm referencing the same one that mentions disagree and commit, because an entire section of this 2016 letter to shareholders is completely focused on high velocity decision making, right? And so here we go into the shareholder letter. Jeff Bezos writes, most decisions should probably be made with somewhere around 70% of the information you wish you had. If you wait for 90%, in most cases, you're probably being slow. Plus, either way, you need to be good at quickly recognizing and correcting bad decisions. If you're good at course correcting, being wrong may be less costly than you think, whereas being slow is going to be expensive for sure. And so I read the story, and obviously there's some important differences between a story like this with Bezos and Operation Neptune Spear. Right, Operation Neptune Spear has a ton weighing on the decision, and you're probably going to go a little bit past 70% of the information you wish you had in that case. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're still not getting to 100%, right? Unless you're at 100%, even if you're at 95%, that still means there's 5% uncertainty, and you're going to have to figure out how to make that decision. And you're going back to what McRaven says, when in command, command. You're going to have to make decisions even though there's still some percentage of uncertainty left. But I did love this part of the shareholder letter that Jeff specifies what that percentage is. He says most decisions should probably be made where somewhere around 70% of the information you had. I know that stuck with me because I think a lot of times I would definitely lean more towards trying to get to 80 to 90 to 95. But as Jeff says here, you've got to move quickly. You got to make these decisions quickly. And if you're waiting till you get to 90%, you may be too slow. That said, there is a balance to all this. And one of the things I thought was really interesting in Lex Friedman's podcast, number 405, he has Jeff Bezos on. And one of the things Bezos says is he calls himself, he said he was often the chief slowdown officer. And so diving in on what he says exactly on the podcast, he says, so when I was the CEO of Amazon, I found myself in the position of being called or of being the chief slowdown officer because someone would bring me a one-way door decision. And I would say, okay, I can think of 3 more ways to analyze that. So let's go do that. And so touching on that, one of the things Jeff Bezos talks about is one-way and two-way door decisions. Essentially a two-way door decision, a decision is a decision that you can make, and if you see that it's the wrong decision, you can easily walk back through that door, right? So it's a two-way door. You can walk through it, and then you can walk back through it, where a one-way door is one that once you walk through it, you cannot walk back. And on that podcast, he uses the example of like, hey, once you choose the propellant for a rocket and you design a rocket for that propellant, that's a one-way door decision. You are going down that path. You cannot go back and change the propellant in a rocket. And he can list off 100 more examples of one-way door versus two-way doors decisions. But the reason that I found this in particular is because, in the shareholder letter, he has this entire section talking about high velocity decision making and how you should be making decisions with around 70% of the information you have. And he's just notorious for high velocity decision making and making things happen. But then on the other side, this is that balance to it, right? He says sometimes he's this chief slowdown officer because someone wouldn't have gotten to the 70%, or maybe they got to this point and they were analyzing it as a one-way door decision, but he thought it could be a two-way door decision. So he would tell them to go back and analyze more, right? Which means, hey, go get more information. We're not at the 70% mark. And so as I read those kind of 2 comments from Jeff, that reminds me of just, hey, that finding that balance of how much data to gather versus when it's time to make a decision is very hard. And it's one of those things that I think it just probably takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reps. And that's why learning from these stories from people like McRaven, from people like Jeff, who have made these decisions hundreds and hundreds of times and have really calibrated how they do that, I think these are some of the lessons that they are trying to pass on to us, whether it's in this book, Wisdom of the Bullfrog, whether it's in Jeff's letter to shareholders. I think this is what I am trying to study. How do I become better at understanding how much data to get and when to make the decision, and how that applies to so many of the different types of problems that we see. And I think another thing I was reminded as I was listening to this was a quote from Alex Hormozy. And one of the things he always talks about is how time is not a requirement for decision making. Information is. And you can see that all throughout here. Jeff's talking about, hey, go analyze that more. McRaven's talking about, hey, in all these different situations, what are we going to do? Making sure that they have all the information they need. They've made all the little decisions that they need to make in order to make the big decision when the time comes. Like McRaven says, I think this is all simple when you lay it out like this, but that doesn't make it easy. These are all very, very hard things to do. And like I said, I think it takes hundreds of repetitions to get it down. And that's why we're studying McRaven and Bezos and all these people. And hopefully that's what I'm going to be getting better at as I learn through doing this. So that's where I'm going to kind of close it out today. There's so much more to cover with McRaven, and I'm sure I'll do more of these podcasts on him in the future. But if you haven't listened to them already, Jocko Podcast 290 is a fantastic one with McRaven. That's where they go over a lot of his books there. I think most of it's C stories, but they go through Hero Code, Make Your Bed, and C stories in that one. And then Jocko Podcast 383 is on Wisdom of the Bullfrog. And if you know me, you know I listen to Jocko Podcast a lot. And Jocko Podcast 383 is probably the one that I've listened to the most. It's my favorite Jocko podcast. I've probably listened to that podcast at least 15 times by this point. If you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend you listen to that. So Thank you, McRaven, for sharing all of these stories and for passing along the leadership lessons that you learned along the way. And with that, I want to finish off with one last story from McRaven. So before the story, this is actually still from the chapter When in Command, Command, and he's talking about how early on in his college time at UT, they're studying McRaven in his class, and here we go into the book. He says, 38 years later, as a 4-star admiral and commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command, I walked into my office in Tampa to find a new desk waiting for me. I was a bit confused as the old desk had seemed perfectly fine, but when I inquired about the desk, my administrative assistant, Senior Master Sergeant Dana Hughes, smiled and said, "Well, sir, we thought this might be a better fit for you." Perplexed, I looked at the desk again. It was older than I first realized. A large executive-style desk with deep grain wood and leather side panels. As I approached the desk, there was a small, framed picture resting on the edge. The man in the picture was unmistakable. It was Admiral Chester Nimitz, and this was his desk. The Navy Archives had been kind enough to loan it to SOCOM for my use. I was humbled beyond measure. For the next 3 years, I sat at that desk, and whenever I thought I had some difficult days, I would remember where I was sitting. I would remember the lives that hung in the balance, the decisions that affected millions, the sense of loss and the sense of victory that Nimitz must have felt. And on those days when I felt indecisive, when I took too much counsel of my fears, when worry threatened to stall my actions, I hearkened back to Nimitz's words, "When in command, command." And with those words as my guide, I always tried to do right by the men and women who served with me.